Two moments reveal the real person Jung warned us about both. When Carl Jung spoke of character, he didn't mean reputation or moral posture. He meant the living pattern of a person's psyche, the way light and shadow dance inside them when life stops being polite. And if you pay attention, he said, you can see a person's essence not through what they intend to show, but through what escapes them when they least expect it. Jung once remarked, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. That transformation, the reaction that strips away pretense, is what reveals character. But most of us are trained to look in the wrong places. We think we can know someone by their manners, their words, or even their consistency. Jung would have smiled at that illusion. He knew that human nature doesn't reveal itself in stability, it reveals itself in rupture. There are, Jung hinted, two kinds of ruptures that give someone away. The first is when the mask slips the persona, that careful social costume tears at the seams and we glimpse what's been hiding underneath. The second is when their projection surfaces, when what they condemn or idealize in others exposes what they cannot yet face within themselves. Together, these two moments form what we might call the twin reveals of the soul. But before we can see them clearly in others, we have to admit we wear them too. Each of us moves through life in disguise. Jung didn't treat that as hypocrisy, it's adaptation. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, he wrote. Without it, we'd be raw nerves, unable to function among others. The problem begins when we forget that the mask is only a mask, when the actor believes he is the role. I remember Jung describing the persona as a sort of compromise between what one really is and what one pretends to be. It's necessary for survival, but fatal for the soul if mistaken for the self. The danger, he said, is that people become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice. In that identification, the authentic personality, what Jung called the individuality, gets buried under applause, expectations, and fear. And then comes the first reveal. It's small at first, a tone that doesn't match the words, a sudden defensiveness, a fleeting envy. In those fractures, you see something deeper than behavior. You see the psyche's tension between image and instinct. Jung called this tension the psychic wound of adaptation. It's what every human carries, the price of belonging. But the second reveal runs even deeper. It comes not from how we act, but how we see. What irritates us, what we can't forgive, what we mock in others. These are mirrors, not portraits. Jung warned, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The moment you feel the sting of judgment, you are staring at a piece of your own unconscious wearing someone else's face. Projection, in his view, is not a moral flaw. It's an unconscious confession. And so, to see someone's true character, Jung would say, watch not what they claim, but what leaks through their control, how their mask fits, and what their projection reveals. These are not moments of failure, but moments of truth. In them, the psyche tries to show its wholeness. Jung believed that the self, the totality of our being, keeps pushing through the cracks, using our mistakes, our anger, even our embarrassment, to remind us of what's real. That's why, in this exploration, we'll follow Jung's path through these two mirrors of the soul. First, we'll look at the mask, the persona, its design, its necessity, and its danger. Then we'll move into projection. The second, reveal the shadow's favorite disguise. And from there, we'll test how both appear in the world, in love, power, and boundaries. Because in the end, to see another clearly is to see yourself without defense. Jung didn't want us to unmask others for judgment. He wanted us to recognize ourselves in the unmasking. And only then, he said, can we begin to understand the mystery of human character, not as something fixed, but as something always becoming. To understand how someone's true character reveals itself, Jung said we must first understand the house it lives in, the psyche. Not the mind as a machine of thoughts, but as an organism of symbols, a living landscape, shaped by consciousness and shadow. The psyche, he wrote, is the greatest of all cosmic wonders and the sine qua non of the world as an object. In other words, without the psyche, there is no world, because all we know of it passes through this inner lens. Jung imagined the psyche as having layers, each with its own voice. The most visible is the ego, the conscious I that says, I think, I feel, I want. It's the navigator of waking life, competent, rational, opinionated. But the ego is not the king, it's the butler. It manages the household, but it doesn't own it. Jung warned that the ego is like a little island floating in a vast sea, and most of that sea lies below the surface, the unconscious. Between the ego and the depths stands the persona, the mask. The persona is what we project outward, a kind of social interface. It's the part of us shaped by the expectations of family, culture, and profession. Jung described it as a functional complex that comes into existence for reasons of adaptation or convenience. In simpler words, it's how we fit in. When you greet someone politely, though you're exhausted, or when you present your professional self at work, that's persona in action. Beneath the persona lies the shadow, the hidden counterpart. Jung said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow contains everything we repress, deny, or fear. Aggression, envy, desire, weakness, creativity, we were told, was inappropriate. But the shadow is not evil by nature. It is energy without a home. It becomes destructive only when disowned. Then, deeper still, beyond persona and shadow, lies what Jung called the self. Not the egoic self that says me, but the archetypal center of wholeness. It is both the goal and the source of psychological life, the quiet intelligence that keeps calling us toward integration. Jung described it as the God within, the totality that transcends opposites. The self contains all oppositions, conscious and unconscious, good and bad, spirit and matter, and seeks their reconciliation. To visualize this architecture, imagine a circle. At the edge is the persona, the thin membrane touching the outer world. Just beneath it is the ego, believing it rules the circle. Below that, in a dim but fertile soil, lives the shadow, its roots entwined with forgotten instincts. And at the very center burns the self, the silent flame that keeps the whole structure alive. Most of us, Jung said, mistake the edge of the circle for the whole. We live at the rim, obsessed with maintaining the mask, while the interior, where vitality, mystery, and truth reside, remains unexplored. The tension between these layers defines character. When someone's persona becomes too rigid, too convinced of its role, the shadow swells with pressure. The psyche, being self-regulating, cannot endure imbalance for long. It compensates. This compensation is what Jung called the autonomy of the unconscious, the psyche's way of correcting our one-sidedness. If someone insists on appearing endlessly kind, their unacknowledged anger will find another outlet. If someone prides themselves on being rational, their repressed emotions may surface as irrational fears. This is why Jungian psychology sees contradiction not as hypocrisy, but as evidence of psychic life. Every personality, no matter how virtuous or controlled, carries a countercurrent. And the more we deny it, the more fate seems to arrange encounters that expose it. Jung once wrote, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. In other words, what we refuse to face within, we will meet in others as conflict, attraction, or betrayal. This inner architecture explains why those two reveals, the mask slipping and the projection erupting, are so potent. They're not accidents of personality, they're structural consequences of how the psyche maintains balance. When the persona cracks, it's not random. It's the self calling attention to forgotten truth. When projection distorts our perception of others, It's the shadow trying to return home. So, before we judge another's reaction or our own contradictions, Jung would ask us to remember, the psyche is not moral, it is symbolic. Every slip of the mask, every misplaced accusation, every overreaction carries meaning. There are messages from one layer to another, small seismic tremors revealing the shape of the unseen interior. And so, to see someone's true character, we must see through these layers to notice not just how they act, but where in the psyche they are speaking from. Are they living from the mask, defending the ego, wrestling with the shadow, or listening to the self? Jung's psychology invites us to see personality as a moving equilibrium, not a label. The task isn't to judge the mask or kill the shadow, but to recognize both as expressions of the same self-seeking wholeness. In the sections ahead, we'll descend from this architectural view into the first of the two great reveals, the mask or the persona. We'll see how it protects us, how it deceives us, and what happens when it breaks. Because the first glimpse of character often arrives not through heroism, but through the quiet fracture of a smile that no longer fits. Every society, Jung said, demands a kind of theater. We are born into a stage already set, handed a role before we even learn our lines. The moment a child realizes that approval follows certain behaviors and silence follows others, the persona begins to form. Jung defined it simply, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. We might think of the persona as a social technology. It protects us from rejection, smooths friction, lets us cooperate. It's the handshake, the smile, the professional voice, the humility of someone who may not feel humble but knows they must appear so. It is both adaptation and armor. And like armor, it becomes dangerous when we forget to take it off. There's a story Jung once told of a pastor who came to him confessing that he no longer believed the sermons he preached. Yet, Jung said, he continued to preach them because he had long ago become his own congregation. That is the fate of the persona when we start performing not for others, but for ourselves. The actor becomes the mask. In analysis, Jung often encountered people who mistook their persona for their soul. The dutiful mother who has forgotten desire, the competent professional who has forgotten imagination, the spiritual teacher who has forgotten humanity. He warned, the danger is that people become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice, the artist with his art. The world may applaud the mask, but applause is not the same as authenticity. To see how the persona functions, imagine 3 circles again. The self in the center, the ego just beyond it, and the persona at the edge facing the world. The persona filters light from the outside and projects an image outward. It tells society, this is who I am. But it also tells the psyche, this is who you must be. It is both messenger and gatekeeper. And over time, if the gate never opens inward, the self begins to retreat. Consider a fictional example. Adrian, a kind and articulate therapist. He listens with patience, speaks with wisdom, embodies calm. Yet at home, he's restless, short-tempered, addicted to distractions. His calmness in the clinic isn't false, it's practiced, but it has become an identity he must maintain at all costs. When a patient accuses him of not understanding, Adrian doesn't merely feel challenged, he feels exposed. His mask is his livelihood, his protection, and his prison. Jung believed that our persona always forms around necessity. It grows out of what society rewards. If you were loved for being helpful, your mask becomes service. If you were praised for being smart, your mask becomes intellect. If you were punished for showing emotion, your mask becomes stoicism. The persona is not random, it's compensation for early vulnerability. But, as Jung noted, every form of compensation is also a potential distortion. What once protected us can later suffocate us. When a person's persona becomes too polished, too consistent, too on brand, something inside begins to rebel. Jung saw this rebellion not as pathology, but as a symptom of imbalance. The unconscious resists being reduced to a role. The individual who is always nice, for example, may suddenly erupt in anger. The rational skeptic may fall into mysticism. The confident performer may withdraw in shame. These contradictions are not moral failures, they are the psyche's cry for wholeness. That's why Jungian psychology treats the persona as both gift and trap. Without it, you cannot belong. With it, you can forget who you are. Jung wrote, "One should not wish to be without the mask, if only because without it one cannot live in the world. But one must not mistake it for the true face." The mature personality learns to use the persona consciously, to wear it like a garment, not like skin. There's also a cultural dimension. Jung observed that entire eras develop collective masks: the modern man, the civilized citizen, the spiritual seeker. These collective personae become moral ideals, yet they also breed collective shadows. The more we identify with progress or purity or rationality, the more we exile our instinctual, chaotic emotional life. And what a society represses in itself, it later meets as its monsters. In therapy, Jung often guided patients to observe their persona at work. "Watch yourself as though you were another person," he would say. "See when your face changes to please, to impress, to defend. The goal wasn't to destroy the mask, but to make it transparent. To know that when you are speaking through it, you are choosing a role, not confusing it with your essence. True character," Jung insisted, "begins when one can see one's own mask and smile at it without panic. To laugh at one's persona is to begin to live freely. But that self-awareness rarely comes without crisis. At some point, every mask cracks. Not because we want it to, but because the self demands truth. The polite facade meets humiliation, the confident ego meets failure, the moral idealist meets temptation. And in that rupture, we encounter the first of Jung's two reveals. The moment when the persona breaks and the shadow steps forward. That moment, Jung wrote, is like the sun's eclipse, frightening, yet necessary for the cycle of renewal. It's there that real character begins to show. Every persona has a fault line. You can't see it under the polish, but it's there, a fine crack running through the mask we show the world. Jung said, "We all wear a mask before others, and sometimes before ourselves. But the mask that fits too tightly begins to suffocate the soul. The first reveal, the first moment when someone's true character emerges, is when that suffocation becomes unbearable and the mask fractures." Jung didn't believe in coincidences when it came to breakdowns. He saw them as messages from the self, demanding rebalancing. The polite man who suddenly lashes out, the controlled woman who breaks down in tears, the confident leader who grows paralyzed by self-doubt, these are not random reversals. They are eruptions of what has been denied. The unconscious refuses to be silenced forever. What you resist not only persists, Jung wrote, but grows in size. Imagine a woman named Elise. For years, she's built a life around being the reliable one. At work, she's the person everyone trusts. In her family, the mediator, the one who never complains. Her persona is golden until one afternoon she explodes over a trivial comment from a colleague. She storms out, trembling, shocked by her own rage. In that moment, Elise sees something terrifying. The image she built no longer contains her. Jung would say the shadow. All her repressed anger, exhaustion, and need for recognition has forced its way through the persona's thin wall. That eruption is painful, but it is also an invitation. Jung taught that the psyche seeks equilibrium, and when one pole of our nature is overemphasized, the opposite will rise. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he warned. The breaking of the mask is therefore not a failure of character, but the beginning of authenticity. The real danger is not eruption, but denial, the desperate effort to patch the persona back together, to pretend nothing happened. Jung saw this constantly in his patients. After a breakdown or moral mistake, They would rush to restore their good image rather than learn from the event. But the psyche, once awakened, doesn't forget. When the persona is shattered, Jung said, the individual must either rebuild it consciously or be devoured by the chaos that follows. Conscious rebuilding means acknowledging the shadow, admitting that the image was too small for the soul that wore it. The moment the persona cracks, the shadow steps into the light not as a villain, but as an orphan returning home. Jung's psychology invites us to watch that moment closely, in others and in ourselves. It's there that character shows. Not in how we maintain perfection, but in how we respond to our imperfection once revealed. Do we double down on performance, or do we begin to integrate the disowned parts? In analysis, Jung often described these breaks as the psyche's equivalent of an earthquake. The conscious structure trembles, revealing the hidden geography underneath. What emerges may be shame, envy, grief, or hunger qualities the ego cannot bear to admit. But Jung insisted that such moments are the only path toward wholeness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The person who can stay present when their mask dissolves, who can look at their own darkness without fleeing, is someone on the path of individuation. We've all seen this first reveal in others. The public figure caught in contradiction, the friend whose calmness snaps into cruelty, the loved one whose sudden confession changes everything. It's tempting to label such moments as hypocrisy, but Jung would say they are revelations. The contradiction is the person, the totality, trying to be known. The persona shows what they want to be. The shadow shows what they are afraid they are. Between those poles, character is forged. Jung compared this confrontation to alchemy, the ancient art of turning lead into gold. The lead is the shadow, heavy, unwanted base. The gold is consciousness born from honesty. In each of us, he wrote, there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. When the persona breaks, that inner stranger speaks in broad daylight. If we can endure that encounter, if we can listen instead of deny, the break becomes transformation. The self begins to reorganize the personality around greater truth. But most people retreat. They glue the mask back on, swear the slip wasn't like them, and return to the role. Jung noted with quiet sadness, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The first reveal, then, is the psychological hinge between two lives, the false and the possible. In the instant the mask breaks, we stand at the threshold of authenticity. But to cross it, we must do something even harder than face ourselves. We must recognize that others' masks will break too, and see their eruptions with compassion. Jung's vision was never to make us judges of character, but witnesses to the human struggle between appearance and truth. And yet, this is only half of the revelation. The first reveal shows what escapes from within. The second shows what we project outward. The next layer of Jung's insight is subtler, the way we use other people as mirrors for our own unconscious. If the first reveal comes when the mask slips, the second begins when the mirror turns. Jung believed that human beings live surrounded by mirrors, other people who unknowingly reflect what we cannot bear to see in ourselves. Everything that irritates us about others, he wrote, can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. It sounds simple, even moralistic, until you realize what he meant, that the traits we condemn, envy, or obsess over in others are the fingerprints of our own shadow. Projection, in Jung's language, is the psyche's secret trick for self-preservation. When we can't integrate something within, we export it. The unconscious doesn't just hide repressed qualities, it projects them outward, coating the world with our internal conflicts. A person who cannot accept their aggression sees hostility everywhere. Someone ashamed of their vulnerability sees manipulation in every kindness. We think we're perceiving others. In truth, we're perceiving our disowned selves. To understand projection Imagine consciousness as a lantern in a dark room. Whatever the light touches becomes me. Everything beyond that circle is not me, but the shadow lives outside that light. And sometimes, rather than expanding the lantern, the psyche throws its contents onto the walls around us, like a movie projector. The image seems external, but its source is internal. Jung said, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. You can see this in everyday life. The friend who constantly complains that everyone else is selfish, but never notices how much he demands from others. The colleague who suspects everyone of hidden motives, unaware that his own ambition drives his suspicion. Even the lover who idealizes their partner beyond reason, seeing divinity where there is only humanity. That too, Jung said, is projection, a gift of the God within to the person without. Projection works both ways. It demonizes and it idealizes. Both are distortions, both forms of blindness. Jung called this participation mystique, a primitive psychological fusion where we lose boundaries between self and other. We fall in love not with the real person, but with the image of our lost completeness. We hate not the other's flaw, but the reflection of our own. In both cases, the unconscious is trying to make itself known through fascination or disgust. Fiction helps us see it clearly. Imagine Marcus, a moral crusader who spends his life denouncing corruption and hypocrisy. He's admired for his integrity, relentless in exposing others' faults. But late one night, Marcus fabricates evidence to prove his point. When caught, he justifies it. The cause was righteous. Jung would call this a classic projection. Marcus has been fighting his own dishonesty disguised as virtue. The stronger the denial, the more vicious the attack. The paradox is that projection is not the enemy, it's the psyche's first attempt at dialogue. When we project, we are unknowingly confessing. The world becomes a screen for our unintegrated qualities to play themselves out until we are ready to reclaim them. This is why Jung saw relationships as sacred laboratories for self-knowledge. The meeting of two personalities, he wrote, is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Each person's shadow meets the other's persona, and sparks fly. But Jung warned, as long as we remain unconscious of projection, we live in a state of enchantment, spellbound by our own fantasies. He said, as long as we do not realize that we ourselves cause a great part of our difficulties, they will remain insoluble. The world seems filled with enemies or idols, when in truth it is filled with mirrors. The work of consciousness begins the moment we ask, why does this person affect me so strongly? To see projection at work, Jung suggested paying attention to intensity. The stronger the emotional charge, the likelier it is that something personal is being reflected. Indifference rarely hides projection. Obsession always does. When someone can't stop speaking about a particular type of person, liars, narcissists, fake people, cold-hearted ones they are, in a sense, describing a part of themselves that they've sent into exile. The psyche doesn't waste energy condemning what is truly foreign. It reserves its fire for what is intimately familiar. Jung likened the process of withdrawing projections to spiritual labor. It is easy to see the shadow in others, he said, but very difficult to see one's own. The moment we reclaim a projection, we experience humility. A quiet recognition that we are less pure and more complex than we thought. This humility, Jung believed, was the seed of real compassion. Once we see our own darkness in another, it becomes harder to condemn and easier to understand. And so, projection is not only diagnostic, it's transformative. Every irritation, every infatuation, every intense judgment is an encrypted message from the unconscious saying, this too is you. When we realize that, the world stops being a battlefield and becomes a mirror hole, sometimes confusing, but always meaningful. But the second reveal doesn't end here. Projection isn't only a theory, It's something we can observe in action. There are moments when someone's speech, tone, or obsession betrays exactly what their unconscious is trying to hide. These are the tells. Jung spoke of the involuntary reveals that expose where the shadow has taken control. If the first reveal shows what slips out from behind the mask, the second reveal shows what spills over into the world. Jung said, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. In other words, what we will not own in ourselves, we will encounter as circumstance, as people who irritate or fascinate us, as endless repetition. This is projection, not as concept, but as lived experience, the world speaking our unconscious back to us. To recognize projection, we must watch the tells, the small, consistent distortions in perception and behavior that expose the shadow's voice. Jung called projection an automatic process, whereby content of the unconscious is transferred to an object outside. It's automatic because it protects us. It's defensive magic. But the magic always leaves traces. The first tell is emotional overreaction. When someone reacts far more strongly than the situation warrants with disproportionate anger, fear, or contempt, it's rarely about the present moment. The psyche has been triggered by its own reflection. Jung would often tell his students, when you feel an emotion that seems exaggerated, ask, what part of myself am I meeting? The second tell is repetition. The same type of conflict appears again and again, the same betrayal, the same disappointment, the same kind of person. Jung described this as the compulsion to repeat, the unconscious attempt to make its content conscious through recurrence. When a person continually meets liars or users or critics, it's worth asking what unacknowledged truth keeps arranging the cast. The third tell is inversion, when someone attacks or mocks exactly what they secretly long for. The cynic who ridicules idealists may be repressing his own longing for belief. The humble person who condemns pride is often driven by hidden vanity. Jung saw these inversions as masks the shadow wears when it cannot yet be integrated. Everything that seeks to be denied, he wrote, will find its way into the world through another door. You can see these tells everywhere once you begin to look in politics, relationships, even spirituality. The loudest condemnations often reveal the deepest fascinations. Jung once remarked, with characteristic irony, fanaticism is always a sign of repressed doubt. The moral crusader, the jealous lover, the gossip who just can't stand fake people, each is performing an unacknowledged dialogue with their own psyche. In fiction, this can be hauntingly clear. Take Clara, a woman who prides herself on her honesty. She despises deceit and never misses a chance to expose it in others. Yet she constantly hides her own motives beneath kindness, manipulating situations to maintain control. Her favorite accusation, "You're not being real with me," is the exact confession her unconscious is trying to make. Jung would say the shadow has hijacked her perception. She's no longer seeing people, but projections of her own disowned cunning. Projection, then, is not only an error of judgment, it's a symptom of psychic possession. When we're projecting, we're not fully conscious. We're animated by what Jung called autonomous complexes, fragments of the psyche that think and feel independently. These complexes use our voice, our language, our certainty. That's why projection feels so convincing. The emotion behind it is real, the target is mistaken. But here lies Jung's profound compassion. Projection is not sin, but communication. The psyche uses projection to reintroduce us to lost parts of ourselves. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, he wrote. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Each time we misjudge someone, overreact, or fixate, the unconscious is sending us a coded invitation. Look closer, this too belongs to you. To witness someone's projections, then, is to glimpse their unfinished dialogue with themselves. Watch what themes dominate their speech: betrayal, purity, injustice, superiority, victimhood. These repeated motifs are not mere opinions. They are the outlines of a private myth. Jung said, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. The more charged the theme, the more it reveals where the psyche is struggling for integration. Projection is also how relationships transform us. Two people meet their personae, smile politely, but their shadows recognize each other instantly. The dance begins. Each sees in the other what they cannot yet accept in themselves. At first, it feels like destiny or disgust, fascination or hatred. But if they can stay conscious of the mirror rather than the illusion, love and friendship become acts of mutual individuation, each helping the other withdraw projection and reclaim their lost wholeness. That, Jung said, is the real purpose of human connection. Not comfort, but awakening. The meeting of two personalities, he reminded, is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The transformation happens the moment projection is recognized as reflection. When you see this in others, you begin to read their character not through what they say about themselves, but through what they say about the world. What annoys them, what they fear, what they idolize. Those are their tells. But when you see it in yourself, when you catch your own projection mid-flight, you begin to experience humility. That humility, Jung believed, is the first real step toward consciousness. And so, the second reveal teaches us the same lesson as the first. The truth of character is not found in perfection, but in how we face what escapes our control. The slipping mask and the speaking projection are not betrayals of who we are. They are revelations of who we might become if we have the courage to listen. Now that we've traced the architecture of the psyche and the two great reveals, the slipping mask and the speaking projection, it's time to bring these ideas into the ordinary world. Jung's psychology was never meant to stay in abstraction. It was a method for seeing. Psychological insight, he said, is worthless unless it alters the way we live. The point isn't to diagnose others, but to perceive with greater consciousness, to watch how truth leaks through behavior, tone, and relationship. So how do we see someone's true character? Not by prying, but by observing how the psyche moves through everyday life. Jung would say, look at the patterns of energy. The psyche always reveals itself through rhythm, through how someone responds to pressure, praise, contradiction, and limitation. Character is not what people declare. It's how their inner opposites reconcile when the world stops cooperating. First field test, the gap between words and energy. Jung believed that every lie of the persona carries a physiological trace. The body speaks when the mask speaks falsely. Watch for what he called incongruence, when language says one thing, but the tone, face, or eyes say another. I'm fine, uttered through clenched teeth. Oh, a laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. These are psychic signatures, places where the persona strains against its own reality. Jung compared this to dream symbolism. In dreams, the unconscious uses contradiction as emphasis. So too, in waking life, contradiction reveals emotional truth. Second field test, the mask change. Every person shifts masks across contexts, at work, at home, in public. This is normal. But Jung noted that integration depends on continuity, the ability to remain inwardly the same person across roles. To see character, observe how someone behaves when their audience changes. Do they adjust with fluidity, or do they become unrecognizable? The person whose voice, posture, and values swing wildly depending on who's watching isn't necessarily dishonest, they're fragmented. Jung would call that over-identification with persona. He who wears too many masks, he warned, forgets which face is his own. Third field test, triggers and themes. Watch what repeatedly provokes strong emotion. Each trigger is a flare from the unconscious. Jung taught that the psyche organizes life around what it still needs to integrate. If anger or judgment keeps recurring in the same pattern, the world is reflecting an unfinished conversation within. For example, the person who cannot stand arrogance may be struggling with their own unclaimed confidence. The one who fears rejection may secretly reject themselves. Life arranges scenes that mirror our unseen conflicts until we recognize them. Fourth field test: humor and sarcasm. Jung observed that humor is the shadow's language in polite society. What someone jokes about obsessively, or the kind of humor they rely on biting, self-deprecating, cruel, absurd, can expose what their unconscious is negotiating. Sarcasm especially often disguises resentment or envy the persona can't admit. When humor becomes a defense instead of release, it marks a place where feeling has been exiled. Fifth field test: the crisis moment. You see someone's nature most clearly not in control but in collapse. Jung wrote that only in a state of emotional crisis does the real personality show itself. How a person behaves when plans fail, when they're humiliated, when they lose status. These are moments when the persona falls silent and the shadow or self speaks. Do they lash out, retreat, or reflect? Do they blame or grow? In the smallest breakdown, you can see the structure of a whole psyche, whether it is rigid or resilient, defended or receptive to transformation. But Jung would caution, these field tests aren't meant to arm us with suspicion. They are invitations to understanding. He said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The task isn't to decode others like puzzles, but to recognize that we are watching versions of our own psychology unfold. Every mask, every projection, every tell we notice in another is a lesson in our own potential blindness. In daily life, Jung suggested an almost meditative stance. Notice, don't rush to interpret. When someone contradicts themselves, don't immediately judge. Ask what energy might be moving beneath their words. When someone's humor cuts too sharply, see it as the psyche's way of balancing power. When a friend repeats the same story of victimhood or betrayal, listen for the myth the soul is trying to complete. To observe this way is to practice psychological empathy, seeing others as symbols of the same forces working within us. The most skillful observers of character are not those who judge quickly, but those who can sit in paradox, who can see the mask and the shadow without collapsing them into fake or evil. Jung said, a human being is a community of selves. To see character is to see that community in motion, to sense how harmoniously or violently its members coexist. And perhaps the most revealing field test of all is how a person handles boundaries, the invisible line where one psyche meets another. Because boundaries are where the persona's performance ends and the shadow's rawness begins. Jung considered boundary moments the ability to say no, to endure rejection, to respect limits as the true measure of integration. That is where we turn next, to the edge between self and other, the place where masks collide and shadows merge, the place where, as Jung saw it, moral character and psychological wholeness are truly tested. Jung once said, the best political, social, and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our own shadow onto others. That withdrawal begins at the threshold the moment we meet another person's limit, because boundaries are where our persona's performance ends and our shadow's honesty begins. They are the friction points of character, the living borders between one psyche and another. We tend to think of boundaries as rules of etiquette or emotional fences, but in Jungian terms, they're psychic membranes, places where two unconscious worlds touch. Every no, every stop, every disagreement is a test of how well we can remain ourselves while recognizing another as different. The way a person handles that tension reveals the degree of integration in their psyche. A healthy boundary is a paradox, firm yet flexible. It knows where the self ends without denying connection. Jung called this the mark of a developed ego, an ego strong enough to mediate between instinct and ideal, shadow and persona. The ego must not be obliterated, he wrote, for it is the bridge to the self. When someone respects both their own limits and another's, you're seeing an ego that has learned to stand in that middle ground without collapsing into defense or control. To understand what boundaries expose, imagine two people arguing. One cannot bear to be wrong, the other cannot bear to be disliked. The first attacks, the second retreats. Both responses, aggression and appeasement, are masks protecting the same fear, the fear of loss of control. Jung would call this inflation and deflation, twin distortions of the ego. The inflated person identifies with their persona, I must win. The deflated person identifies with their shadow, I am always wrong. Both reactions reveal immaturity, a psyche not yet capable of holding tension. Boundaries reveal this maturity more clearly than words ever could. Watch how a person reacts to no. Do they negotiate, respect, retaliate, or manipulate? The one who can hear no without crumbling or coercing has met their own shadow and made peace with limitation. Jung said, only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Boundaries are paradox. They separate and connect. They protect and expose. There's also the subtler side, how someone sets their own limits. Those who cannot say no are usually at war with their shadow's aggression. Those who say no to everything are defending against their shadow's vulnerability. In both cases, the unintegrated energy leaks through relationships. The nice person who suppresses anger becomes resentful. The independent person who fears dependence becomes isolated. Jung observed that the moral task of adulthood is not to pick a side, but to hold opposites in conscious tension, to let both energies live without one devouring the other. Consider a simple scene. A friend asks for help, but you are exhausted. Your persona says yes because it wants to be kind. Your shadow says no because it wants rest. The real test of character lies in the space between those impulses. Can you acknowledge both voices, find the honest middle, and respond without resentment? Jung called this individuation in action, the art of staying true without severing connection. Boundaries also reveal projection in motion. Whenever someone violates yours, you learn how they treat their own inner limits. The manipulative colleague who refuses to take no for an answer isn't just disrespectful, they're at war with their own helplessness. By controlling others, they avoid feeling their shadow's dependence. Likewise, when we can't endure someone else's autonomy, it's often because it mirrors the parts of ourselves we can't control. Boundaries are mirrors twice over. They show who we are and how we see others. Jung believed that the ability to maintain boundaries without hostility was one of the rarest signs of individuation. It means you can meet the other, whether human or archetypal, without being swallowed. No tree, he wrote, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The root here is our capacity to know our darkness well enough that we don't need to project it onto others or punish them for carrying their own. In practical life, this looks simple. Listening without collapsing, disagreeing without humiliating, saying no without guilt, apologizing without shame. But psychologically, it's the hardest work, because each of these acts forces us to balance opposites: strength and humility, selfhood and empathy, persona and shadow. And perhaps this is why boundaries are where real character shines. Not in grand virtue or public identity, but in the invisible choices we make when two souls collide. To respect another's boundary is to honor their self. To keep our own is to honor ours. In both acts, the shadow is kept conscious, not projected, and the persona becomes transparent rather than rigid. Boundaries, in the Jungian view, are moral artistry. They are where love matures into consciousness. They are where the ego learns humility before the reality of the other, and where the self begins to emerge as something larger than both. From here, Jung would lead us beyond the outer edge of these interactions toward the deeper interior, where the question is no longer how to see others' character, but how to integrate our own. Because once the mask has cracked, The shadow has spoken, and the boundaries have been tested. What remains is the lifelong task Jung called individuation, the third path, where all the opposites meet and transform. Jung once wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." Integration is that outgrowing the moment when life's contradictions are no longer problems to fix, but tensions to live consciously. It's what happens when the mask no longer defines us, when the shadow no longer terrifies us, and when the boundary between self and other becomes a meeting point rather than a battlefield. Up to now, we've been exploring how character is revealed through the slipping persona, the voice of projection, the test of boundaries, but Jung would say, revelation is only the beginning. The task isn't merely to see the truth, but to let that truth reorganize our lives. That process, he called individuation the third way, the path beyond the mask and the shadow, where wholeness begins to replace the war within. Integration does not mean perfection or purity. Jung detested both words. "I would rather be whole than good," he said. To be whole is to accept the multiplicity within us, to see that every virtue casts a shadow and every flaw hides a potential. The persona's kindness contains repression. The shadow's rage conceals vitality. When we integrate, we allow both energies to belong. The mask softens, the shadow gains a voice, and together they become character. This work begins with recognition, seeing our contradictions not as hypocrisy but as human complexity. Jung wrote that the self, the organizing center of the psyche, seeks unity, not sameness. The self wants our opposites to converse. So when anger breaks through niceness, or vulnerability seeps through pride, the psyche is not malfunctioning, it is correcting its imbalance. Each eruption, each projection, each emotional crack is the self calling us toward inclusion. Think of integration as the alchemy of opposites. The alchemists, whom Jung studied deeply, spoke of turning lead into gold. For Jung, that lead was the raw, rejected material of the psyche, our envy, our shame, our fear. The gold was consciousness, the ability to hold that material without being ruled by it. The gold, he wrote, is the light born of darkness, and every person who confronts their shadow, listens to their projections, and reclaims them as their own, is performing that alchemy of character. But integration is not achieved by force. It grows through relationship with others and with the unconscious itself. Jung described the unconscious as a living presence that must be met with respect, even reverence. The unconscious is not a wastebasket, he said. It is a living entity that speaks in symbols. To integrate means to enter dialogue with this entity, to listen to dreams, to reflect on impulses, to see patterns in life as communications rather than coincidences. At first, this can feel like disillusionment. The persona crumbles, the shadow accuses, the old certainties dissolve. Jung compared individuation to a descent. No one can touch the bottom of their own soul without pain. Yet he also believed that through this descent comes freedom, because when the opposites are no longer enemies, energy returns. The person who once exhausted themselves maintaining an image begins to feel alive again. In analysis, Jung often described this stage with the symbol of the mandala, the circle containing symmetry. He noticed that patients approaching inner wholeness would spontaneously draw circular figures, as if their psyche were expressing its new order visually. The mandala represented the self's emergence, the center uniting the chaos of fragments. Integration, then, is not about eliminating conflict, but about discovering the still point around which conflict revolves. One could say that true character begins here not in morality, but in authenticity. A person who has integrated knows their own capacity for contradiction and no longer fears it. They can be strong without arrogance, humble without self-effacement, kind without deceit. They no longer need to perform goodness because they have accepted their darkness. Jung described such a person as transparent to themselves. This transparency has moral consequences. The integrated person does not project their shadow into the world. They recognize it before it escapes. They can love without idealizing, criticize without cruelty, lead without domination. Jung believed this inner work was also ethical work, the only antidote to collective evil. The man who looks outward dreams, he warned, but the man who looks inward awakens. When enough individuals awaken to their own complexity, societies become less possessed by ideology and fear. Integration also transforms how we see fate. Instead of repeating the same patterns unconsciously, we begin to choose consciously. The same people and problems may appear, but we respond differently. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Integration is what changes fate into freedom, the ability to respond rather than react. And so, after the reveals, after the mask breaks and the projection speaks, the true work begins. To stand among our fragments and say, all of this is me. The moment we can hold both our persona and our shadow without denial, we stop living as half a soul. The opposites cease their civil war, and the self begins to shine through them, not as a concept but as a felt coherence. Integration doesn't end with enlightenment. It begins with honesty. And in that honesty lies the quiet beauty Jung devoted his life to describing. That our brokenness and our brilliance are not enemies, but two halves of the same pattern trying to become whole. From here, Jung would have us turn the mirror completely, not toward others, but toward the observer. Because if everything we've seen in others reflects us, then the final reveal is the one that occurs when we dare to watch ourselves. By now we've learned to see the mask that conceals, the projection that betrays, the boundaries that reveal, and the process that reconciles them all. Yet Jung would remind us that everything we've studied about others remains incomplete until we turn the same gaze inward. The outer world, after all, was only ever a canvas for the psyche's own reflection. Who looks outside dreams, he said. Who looks inside awakens. The final test of character, then, is not how clearly we can read another person, but how honestly we can read ourselves. Because the very act of perceiving is colored by the structure of our own psyche. We don't merely watch others' masks and shadows. We project through our own. To see another clearly, Jung warned, we must first become aware of the lens through which we look. It begins in small moments of recognition. The sting of irritation when someone reminds you of yourself. The sudden admiration that feels too intense. The righteous certainty that I would never do that. Each is a clue that the unconscious has entered the room. Jung advised his students, if you want to see clearly, you must learn to stand a little apart from yourself to watch the watcher. This watching is not cold detachment. It is compassionate curiosity. When we turn the mirror inward, we practice what Jung called moral introspection, not guilt, but awareness. It's the willingness to notice our own persona at work, the moments when we become the expert, the good one, the wounded one, the seeker, to watch the mask as it forms and softens, and to say, ah, there you are again. To do this, Jung encouraged a lifelong dialogue with the unconscious. He practiced what he called active imagination, entering into conversation with the figures that appeared in dreams or fantasies, treating them as living aspects of the psyche rather than illusions. The psychological rule, he said, is that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. Active imagination reverses that rule. It brings the drama home so it doesn't have to play out in the world. For example, when we notice ourselves drawn to criticize someone harshly, we can pause and ask, what am I trying to avoid seeing in myself? If we feel sudden jealousy or resentment, we can listen. What power or freedom have I exiled that this person carries for me? Each uncomfortable emotion becomes a messenger. Jung called this the art of listening to the soul. It transforms judgment into dialogue and projection into revelation. Over time, this practice reshapes perception itself. We begin to see life less as a collection of villains and heroes, and more as a symbolic map of our own interior. Every person becomes a character in our individuation story, reflecting something of the self. This doesn't erase morality, it deepens it. Compassion no longer means condoning harm, it means understanding its origin. We begin to sense that beneath all the masks, every person wrestles with the same paradox: the need to belong and the need to be whole. Turning the mirror inward also reveals a subtler truth, that our persona and shadow are not enemies but partners in creation. The persona brings form, the shadow brings depth. Without the mask, life would be chaos. Without the shadow, it would be hollow. Integration allows us to stand between them, transparent but not exposed, rooted but not rigid. And so the question changes. It's no longer who is real, but what in me remains unconscious. Jung believed that humility, true humility, is born in this recognition, that I am both light and dark, wise and foolish, generous and selfish, sometimes within the same breath. Knowing your own darkness, he wrote, is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. As we practice this inward seeing, a quiet shift occurs. The compulsive need to interpret others dissolves into empathy. We realize that everyone we meet is carrying the same architecture: ego, persona, shadow, self, and that every argument, every heartbreak, every misunderstanding is a dialogue between unseen parts of the human whole. To know this is to grow gentle. In the end, Jung's psychology is not about theory, but intimacy. Intimacy with oneself, and by extension, with life. When we can hold our own contradictions without shame, we can hold others without judgment. The gaze that once sought to uncover character now becomes the gaze of compassion. This perhaps is what Jung meant by individuation. Not becoming exceptional, but becoming real. The mirror turned inward does not show perfection, it shows participation. It shows that we too are part of the pattern we observe, that every insight we've gained about the human soul also describes our own. And so, when we next find ourselves judging, idealizing, resenting, or admiring, we might remember the world is not a stage of strangers, it is the living projection of our own becoming. To turn the mirror inward is to begin the long work of consciousness, the only work that transforms perception into wisdom and knowledge into love. We began with a question: how can you see someone's true character? Jung's answer, scattered across a lifetime of work, was both simple and terrifying. Watch what breaks and watch what blames. 2 moments reveal the real person: when the mask slips and when the projection speaks. One shows what has been hidden within, the other what has been cast without. Together, they trace the boundary between who we think we are and who we truly are. When the mask breaks, when the persona falters, the unconscious rushes forward, exposing the emotions we've been taught to suppress. It is then that we meet the shadow, the unowned, unpolished part of our being that holds both our darkness and our vitality. Jung called it the brother of our soul. We spend years running from it, yet it is the only part of us that can make the rest real. When the projection speaks, when we accuse, idealize, or condemn, we meet the shadow again, but this time disguised as the outer world. What we can't stand in others is usually what we haven't yet accepted in ourselves. Jung warned, the things we dislike in others are characteristics we secretly possess. To recognize this is humbling, to deny it is to live blind. But here lies the paradox at the heart of Jung's psychology. Both of these moments, the rupture of persona and the eruption of projection, are not mistakes in the human system. They are messages from the self. The psyche wants to be whole, and wholeness requires exposure. The cracks in our image are not failures of character, they are how the light enters the system of the soul. So we learn to watch these two reveals differently. We stop seeing them as evidence of deceit or hypocrisy and begin to see them as evidence of humanity. The friend who contradicts themselves, the leader who loses composure, the partner who lashes out. They're not showing their downfall, they're showing their structure. Jung would remind us, every individual is a question which no one can answer completely. Character, therefore, is not a finished product, but a living question that life keeps asking. And when we recognize this in others, something softens in ourselves. We stop dividing the world into good and bad, strong and weak, true and false. We begin to see that everyone is negotiating between their persona and shadow, that every human face is a mask trembling before its own mirror. The point is not to tear the mask away, but to make it translucent, to let the shadow's depth give it soul. In the end, the two reveals, the slipping mask and the speaking projection, are mirrors of the same mystery. The psyche striving toward consciousness. Each time we fall apart, each time we misjudge, each time we project our darkness onto the world and then recognize it, we participate in that evolution. Jung's psychology is not a theory of perfection. It's a theology of becoming. He said, only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. And paradox is exactly what these reveals give us. The persona that hides but also protects, the shadow that destroys but also heals, the boundaries that separate but also connect, the projections that deceive but also teach. To see someone's true character, then, is to see them as a paradox in motion, not an object to judge, but a soul mid-transformation. And to see yourself in that same light is the beginning of wisdom. We started with the line, 2 moments reveal the real person. Jung warned us about both. Now we end with a gentler truth. Those 2 moments also reveal our shared humanity. When you see the mask break or the projection speak in yourself or another, don't rush to moralize. Listen. The psyche is speaking in its oldest language, contradiction. If spirit lifts and soul roots, then the space between them, between persona and shadow, is where life actually happens. That is the terrain of character. Jung's lifelong message was not to escape that tension, but to live it consciously. We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises, he wrote. And in those meetings with others, with the world, with ourselves, we discover that every reveal, every fracture, every mirror is an invitation to become whole. So perhaps the truest measure of character is not how well one hides or displays the self, but how tenderly one tends to the fragments that appear when both masks fall away. For that is where consciousness begins, not in the perfection of image, but in the courage to see. Jung often said that real change begins not with grand insight, but with attention. The psyche, he believed, does not ask for control, only for consciousness. Until you make the unconscious conscious, he warned, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The practice of seeing, then, is not about diagnosing others or chasing purity. It is a daily act of turning awareness toward what moves unseen within and around us. You begin simply by noticing. Notice the moments when your mask tightens, when you feel the need to perform, to prove, to please. Don't tear the mask away, just acknowledge it. Say quietly, I see you. Notice, too, when judgment flares, when someone's behavior hooks you, when you find yourself irritated, envious, or superior. Pause. Ask, what in me is speaking? Jung called this withdrawing projection. And it's one of the most radical acts of self-responsibility a human being can perform. Over time, this noticing deepens into a kind of vision. The world begins to appear as a living mirror. Every face, every event, every irritation, a reflection of something unfinished within. Instead of blaming or idealizing, you start to listen. You realize that what you meet outside is shaped by what remains unseen inside. The critic reveals your insecurity, the liar your fear of honesty, the free spirit, your buried desire for risk. Every encounter becomes a small revelation, a chance to reclaim a lost part of the soul. And so, seeing becomes a practice of love, not sentimental love, but the love born of understanding. You stop demanding perfection from others because you have seen the imperfect wholeness of yourself. You stop confusing politeness with peace, and you start to value authenticity over harmony. You begin to meet life, as Jung did, as a dialogue between consciousness and mystery. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." That awakening is not a single event. It's a rhythm, contraction and expansion, shadow and light, forgetting and remembering. Every day, the mask reforms and the projection resumes. Every day, consciousness must rise again to meet them. This is the practice of seeing. To walk through life with eyes that are both sharp and soft. Sharp enough to discern truth, soft enough to forgive it. To see the persona without contempt, the shadow without fear, and the world not as an enemy, but as a mirror. When you live this way, revelation ceases to be a rare event. It becomes a way of being. The two great reveals, the mask slipping and the projection speaking, no longer feel like crises, but conversations with the self. Each mistake, each overreaction, each emotional storm becomes another chance to wake up a little further. And perhaps that is what Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not to escape the opposites, but to see them clearly and keep walking, eyes open, heart aware, mask in hand.